the Bible, we read reports of people who lived 600, 700, 800, and even over 900 years. But are these ages really real? Or did people count the time differently in antiquity? After all, why did people live so many years in Old Testament times? Watch this video until the end, because that's exactly what we'll talk about now. The first thing we need to do is admit that the Bible does not explain why people lived many years in the Old Testament. In fact, the Bible speaks only of a period of human history when people had such a long life that could go through 900 years. And this period occurred before the flood that destroyed humanity, as recorded in the book of Genesis between chapters 6 and 8. According to the biblical text, before the flood it seemed normal for people to live hundreds of years. But although the Bible does not explain why people lived many years at the time of the Old Testament, some hypotheses are raised by scholars. For example, some people suggest that at that time was told differently. However, since you have news, the man has always calculated the years in periods of at least 360 days. This is because this count had to do with lunar cycles and the stations. To get an idea, around 5000 before Christ, some peoples already used 365-day calendars. Therefore, regardless of the type of calendar, the years have always been years. So saying that people lived many years in the Old Testament because time was told differently is very, very unlikely. Other people argue that this was not a different method of telling the weather, but in a symbolic or figurative way to describe people's lives. A possibility pointed out by those who defend this theory is that perhaps the high age of people in the Old Testament did not represent the longevity of an individual in private, but represented the longevity of his dynasty. But of course, considering the age of people who lived many years in the Old Testament as symbolic, instead of literal, is not the only explanation for this issue. Within the biblical narrative, it makes sense to understand that at the beginning of humanity, really people lived many years. And this could be related to the natural condition of life at that time, and especially a theological purpose. So yes, one of the hypotheses raised by the Old Testament scholars says that people lived many years at that time because the living conditions before the flood were very different. In this sense, it is suggested that there was some difference in the atmosphere of the earth that much more protected life on the planet, allowing people to live so many years. Even the book of Genesis seems to indicate that before the flood did not rain on earth, and that the planet was wrapped in some kind of water, providing a specific climate at that time. But with the flood, the living conditions on earth were deeply altered, and these antediluvian characteristics disappeared. Who defends this hypothesis suggests that this would explain why after the flood people have stopped living so many years. And here comes a question. Is it possible to prove this hypothesis? No, biblically, because the Bible is not a scientific book. This is not her purpose. But in any case, even within the scientific community, there is the defense that at some point in the past, there was a drastic climate change that greatly changed people's living conditions on Earth. And even within this line of reasoning that people lived many years at that time because of living conditions, some scholars argue that people's longevity was also related to greater purity in man's genetic code. As those were the first generations of the human race, many diseases and weaknesses had not yet been developed among people. And about all this, many people often say that this kind of subject is just biblical stories, with the clear goal of discrediting biblical accounts. But it's not quite. Interestingly, ancient documents discovered by archaeology also refer to people who have been allegedly lived many years. In the Sumeria Kings list, for example, there is a record of men who had a huge longevity before a large flood occurred on Earth. Although the age of these people in the cuneiform tablets are as much as fanciful, it is evident that different peoples were certain that in antiquity people lived a long time. However, despite the likely differences in living conditions at that time, no doubt the advanced age of some biblical characters of the Old Testament can also be explained in the light of the theological purpose for them to live so much. This means that although there could be natural or even supernatural causes so that people lived hundreds of years before the flood, all this occurred according to God's purpose. In making people live many years during this period of the Old Testament, God allowed humanity to develop in its initial period. Moreover, with people living many years, the knowledge of God was preserved and transmitted to later generations. It is worth remembering that at that time writing did not exist and knowledge was communicated through oral tradition. Thus, the original witnesses played a key role in the conservation and integrity of information. So, for example, with Adam, their children and grandchildren living hundreds of years, God's knowledge was consistently perpetuated in the human lineage. In other words, a person born after 800 years of the fall of man in Eden could still know the first man created by God and get from him all the details about divine revelation. And then, when God's purpose was fulfilled in this sense, naturally, the life expectancy of man was reduced until it reached the normal standards of today. That is, there was a gradual drop in the life expectancy of people who, 900 or 800 years old, began to live 700, 600, 500, 400, then 300, 200, until it gets close to 100 years, which is the maximum longevity registered currently. In Abraham's time, for example, it seems that the age of people still exceeded 150 years. But shortly thereafter, at the time of Moses, the average of a person's life was between 70 and 80 years old. In Psalm 90, written by Moses, he observes exactly that when he says that a person's life days reach 70 years, and some, for his robustness, reach 80 years. But with tired and boring. And this psalm is an interesting detail against the idea that at that time the years were told differently. This is because Moses wrote the book of Genesis. That is, the record written about people who lived hundreds of years was made by the same man who wrote that a person lives about 80 years. This is, in its time. Yet, even though Moses, knowing that this was no longer the reality of the longevity of the people of his time, he recorded that, in antiquity, before the flood, people lived hundreds of years. And he did so without leaving any indicative that his record was a figurative way of talking about the time of a dynasty, the longevity of a clan, and not specifically about the longevity of a person. Therefore, it seems reasonable to understand that Moses intentionally recorded those ages in a historical account, although he did not propose to explain exactly why people reach such advanced ages. Now, I want to know about you. What do you think about the idea of people Bible times have lived so many years?
If something in you became quieter, clearer, or maybe even more restless after this video, then it was already worth it. Let us know what you felt, tell us your city, and if you can, subscribe and send it to someone who would appreciate this too. These little actions help the message go further. Thank you, Big Hug, and see you in the next video.